As any of you guys who have followed this series for some time will doubtless have noticed, we quite often cover supercar concepts which ultimately didn't reach production or were victims of circumstance or various other reasons that essentially caused just that, them to never truly reach fruition. A couple of them perhaps had one or two built or sold the original concept. I believe, for instance, the Chrysler ME412 concept was actually sold. The quoted price was somewhere in the region of $4 million, I believe it was back in the day. But others, they just never go any further. They end up in heritage collections or museums of the manufacturers, and we've discussed some of these, stuff like the Bugatti Chiron concept, of course, which actually surprised me by being one of the most popular episodes of this series so far. Now, this comes from a fairly similar time period. It's a little bit later than stuff like the Bentley Honneur or the Chiron itself or the Nardo, but it's a similar kind of time. A lot of really cool supercar concepts were coming out in the late 90s and the very early 2000s. You even had some which we haven't even discussed, like the Maybach Accelero, the Peugeot 907 Coupe, which I think is a stunning looking car, and a variety of others as well. Now this one is one which isn't as talked about. It's also one which not as many people know about, which probably lends into that former reason. Now the car is called, creatively, the BlackJag, which by inference is of course a Jaguar, but technically speaking it's actually not a Jaguar. It was designed and intended to be a Jaguar supercar, but it wasn't actually designed by Jaguar. It was designed by Fuore, which is an Italian design house, and they're not doing that great. They folded in 2007, and the result of that, or one of the results, was that there was a rumour that you could actually buy this exact car for a very affordable $3.8 million. But there is only one in existence, so for the right collector, it could be something like the British equivalent, in kind of a roundabout sense, to the Chrysler ME412. Now, it's nowhere near as quick as the Chrysler, it doesn't have anywhere near the power, but what it does have is a very tasty mix. So see if this sounds like it appeals to you, and maybe you could drop $3.8 million on this car. So, what do you actually get? Well, it's a very interesting concept. It's a world apart from the XJ220, and it's even nothing like the CX75, which came later and is one of my personal favourite supercar concepts. So this is what you get. You get the same amount of cylinders as a Carrera GT. You get the same engine size as a Zonda S. You get the same power as a Lamborghini Murcielago. You get the top speed of a Mosler MT900 GTR, the 0 to 60 time of an SLR McLaren, and the price of, near enough, a Chrysler ME412, or supposedly. It does seem a little bit shady as to whether or not it was a legitimate sale, given that it was on a pretty obscure website rather than an obvious car selling one or a top marks kind of website. But that's a pretty interesting mix. It is, as I alluded to just now, a V10. 10 cylinders, just like the Carrera GT, and it's a 7-litre V10, which is a very tasty sounding engine, 640 naturally aspirated horses, and the performance sounds very good, especially given that this car came out, or rather didn't come out, it was just a concept, in 2004. In 2004, Fuore quoted a 0 to 60 time of 3.8 seconds and a top speed of 210 miles per hour. Now, there's one particular similarity that I actually didn't mention about this car, and this one is one of the most impressive of all, and that is the weight. This weighs the same as a Gumper Apollo, 1,350 kilos, which is just under 3,000 pounds. That's very impressive for a supercar of any modern time to weigh that little while still being a genuine luxury supercar, as this one is. This is not a stripped out track day special like a Mosler or even the Gumper is. So it's actually very impressive that this car weighs that little, or at least that's the quoted weight, and it seems like they could probably get that right. It's not too difficult to weigh a car, but the specs do vary a little bit sometimes, at least according to Fuore. They have sometimes said it has 900 horsepower. Well, you might be quoting that a little bit off, guys, but 640 sounds fairly accurate. It's certainly believable. And although those who do know about this car tend to talk about this one, for obvious reasons, this car is actually the successor to another concept car from the year before, because in 2003, Ford, the same design house, made a car called the XF10, which looks almost identical but in silver. You could even be forgiven for assuming it was the same car, but in a different colour, but it's actually not. If you put them side by side, they are different. The proportions are a little bit different. The XF10 appears to be a little bit longer. I'm not sure if it is, but it just looks it at least. It has 4 exhausts instead of 2 on this car. The same engine though, the same power, and the performance is roughly quoted to be the same. So it's basically just an alternative design version. And of course the name BlackJag is a little bit more attention-seeking than XF10. Although, funnily enough, XF would, of course, end up having a lot more use from the Jaguar brand. And it's interesting, and I do kind of like this, that although it wasn't an official Jaguar from day one, and it ended up not being an official Jaguar at all, really, it's interesting to see how so many of the individual design cues of this car actually did end up being very similar to later Jaguar models, including the XF, and the XK, the rear lights in particular, look very similar to the Jaguar XK Coupe. So overall, it's a car which, like so many other supercar concepts, some which we already mentioned, others as well, like the Peugeot Oxia, a variety of others, they just don't get the chance to reach the light of day. And in some cases more than others, that really is a shame. Now ultimately, I think that this car's visuals in particular, to some degree the interior, but mostly from the outside, could divide opinion. It's not, conventionally speaking, necessarily a pretty car. I'm not really a huge fan of the design. I do think it's a striking looking car, but it looks a little bit Veyron-esque, a little bit Bentley Nordier-esque, which is understandable why some people may have overlooked it back then as just a rip-off of those cars, considering it came out about 4 years later. So it's understandable that it didn't do that well, it didn't reach production, but at the same time, it is kind of a shame, I think, because it would be cool to see if this car, like vehicles such as the CLK GTR, the Carrera GT, the SLR McLaren, and the Enzo, the MC12, that kind of thing as well, from slightly earlier time periods of supercars, late 90s, early 2000s, if it could keep its value, or potentially even increase it, like those cars have, or if it would have dropped, as its predecessor, the XJ220, did for a while. That car dropped, plummeted in fact in value, and then has picked up again in recent years. So it could have been interesting to see what would have happened with this car. But either way, it did not reach production. Possibly you can buy one, who knows at this point, probably not really, but it's a cool concept to entertain, and it's a cool concept car overall, and one which doesn't have anywhere near the kind of exposure as many of the other obvious choices, some of which we mentioned. So if you are new to this series, of course you can check out plenty of other obscure, weird, wacky and wonderful cars that we've already discussed, and of course stick around for plenty more. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.